When one hears the phrase Tea Party, the mind inevitably turns to Boston, a harbor full of chess, patriots in disguise, and an act of defiance that rippled across the Atlantic. But Boston was not the only city to reject British-imposed taxation in 1773. The same autumn, nearly 300 miles to the southwest, Philadelphia, a city of merchants, Quakers, and political moderates, faced its own confrontation with the East India Company's tea. Yet the response here wasn't one of destruction or disguise. Rather, it was strategic, principled, and deeply rooted in a belief that dissent need not be disorderly. This is the story of the Philadelphia Tea Protest, a quiet, determined stand that challenged imperial authority and helped forge the path to revolution. To grasp the stakes in Philadelphia, we must first examine the imperial policies that galvanized opposition throughout the colonies. By 1773, tensions had been mounting for nearly a decade. The Stamp Act of 1765 and the Townshend Duties of 1767 had already sparked widespread unrest, premised on the constitutional principle of no taxation without representation. Though several of these taxes were repealed, one notable duty remained: a 3-pence levy on imported tea. The Tea Act of 1773 was not in itself a tax. Rather, it allowed the East India Company, facing immense financial distress, to export tea directly to the colonies without going through London middlemen. This made British tea cheaper than smuggled Dutch tea, even with the duty included. But colonists recognized the real danger. Purchasing this tea meant accepting Parliament's right to tax them, a precedent they were unwilling to set. Philadelphia, the largest city in British North America at the time, was no stranger to colonial resistance. It was here that non-importation agreements were organized in response to the Stamp and Townshend Acts, and it was home to vocal critics of imperial policy such as John Dickinson, whose letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania had shaped colonial political discourse. But Philadelphia was also a Quaker city, a community rooted in pacifism, order, and deliberation. Among its most prominent merchants were Abel James and Henry Drinker, partners in the firm James and Drinker. They were respected members of the Society of Friends and signatories to earlier boycotts of British goods. In 1773, they were approached by their London correspondents, Piggin and Booth, and offered the opportunity to serve as the tea consignees for the East India Company. The decision placed them in the center of a constitutional crisis that was as much about identity and authority as it was about tea. The extensive correspondence between James and Drinker and their London partners offers a rare window into the transatlantic nature of the tea controversy. In letters dated May and July of 1773, Piggin and Booth assured James and Drinker that the tea shipments would be modest and profitable. They emphasized that Boston had previously paid the tea duty without much protest, implying that Philadelphia would likely do the same. But this proved a gross miscalculation of political sentiment on the ground. By October, word of approaching tea cargoes had circulated, and the opposition grew increasingly vocal. On October 16th, hundreds of Philadelphians convened at the State House. They passed a series of resolutions, modeled closely on those later adopted in Boston, declaring the Tea Act a violation of their liberties and branding anyone who facilitated the landing or sale of the tea as an enemy to his country. The next day, a 12-man committee was dispatched to confront the consignees. Among their targets was James and Drinker. The scene was not one of violence or public spectacle, but the stakes were nonetheless high. The committee demanded an immediate resignation from the tea agency, even though the tea had not yet arrived and no formal commission had been delivered. James and Drinker, committed to transparency and peace, refused to resign on speculative grounds. Instead, they offered a careful response. They would act in accordance with public interest and would not proceed in opposition to the general sense of their fellow citizens. Their refusal to commit one way or another was met with suspicion. That evening, when the committee reported their findings at the coffee house, their account of James and Drinker's reply was met with hisses from the crowd. Their statement was later clarified in a public notice, reaffirming the opposition to the revenue laws and promising full transparency, but by then the public sentiment had turned decisively against all potential consignees. Even principled neutrality was no longer acceptable. Unlike in Boston, where protests culminated in the destruction of tea, Philadelphia's confrontation ended before the cargo ever touched land. When the Polly, the ship carrying the consignment of East India Company tea, arrived at the mouth of the Delaware River in early December, it was met with immediate resistance. A crowd of some 8,000 gathered at the State House, reiterating their resolve that the tea must not be landed. Captain Ayres, recognizing the futility and likely fear an escalation, turned his vessel back to London. Thus, without a single chest being destroyed, Philadelphia had effectively nullified the Tea Act within its jurisdiction. Philadelphia's tea protest has long been overshadowed by Boston's theatrical defiance, yet historians increasingly recognize the importance of this quieter resistance. What distinguishes Philadelphia is not the lack of opposition, but the method by which it was expressed, rooted in consensus building, legal process, and civil restraint. Figures like Henry Drinker embodied a strand of patriotism not rooted in riot or rebellion, but in ethical conviction, civic duty, and constitutional principle. Indeed, the effectiveness of the Philadelphia protest in preventing tea from landing without a single act of violence set a model for lawful, coordinated opposition. It also underscores the diversity of revolutionary expression. The road to independence wasn't paved with solely acts of destruction, but also with letters, meetings, petitions, and moral courage. The American Revolution was not a singular event, but a series of collective decisions made in cities and towns across the continent. Philadelphia's tea protest reminds us that even measured resistance can be revolutionary. It was, in its own right, a quiet turning point, and one that deserves to be remembered. I'm Dr. Lucas Wilder. This is History Gone Wilder, and I'll see you next time.